know what I really enjoy about objective measurements, right? So
Nothing.
you nothing is what I said. You recently reviewed the Encore B6, right?
Yeah.
And I commented like, oh, I seem to be more impressed, right? But we have a reference point. Like we can both look at the measurements and still like disagree even, right? We can still even
Right.
not have come to the same exact conclusion, but
Yeah, because
I
you're
can't
wrong.
argue with
I
what the
get it.
measurement is saying, right? It's like, huh?
I said, yeah, because you're wrong. I was just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I here's what I take from it is when you have some good measurements, sometimes I don't know if you ever do this, but you go back to the speakers that you've reviewed before and you look for something that you noticed that's in the measurement, right? So you may have forgotten, right? But the details are in the measurement itself. Like, so on that Encore B6, I remember thinking, I'm impressed with the bass on this bookshelf, right? But looking at the measurement, I'm like, well, the F3 isn't that impressive. It was like 67 hertz, right? Nothing that, impressive.
Right.
I mean, it's a pretty big bookshelf.
It is. Yeah.
The enclosure. So I'm like, what? Am I crazy? Why is it when I was reviewing it that I was so impressed with the bass response? Right? Even though the F3, which is what most people look at, and what I usually look at, didn't look so impressive. But then I looked at the F10, right? So how fast did it the bass roll off? And it didn't roll off as steep as some other bookshelf speakers. So I'm like, oh, see, like I'm saying, it was there in the data.
Just depends on what you're looking for, right?
Exactly. So I wasn't looking for the right things.
Yeah, initially. I think that's a good and perfect example of how, depending on what you're looking for, you may or may not find it, right? And that's the cool thing about the data is, I may not mention something or I may say something that, go look at the data and you're like, well, I don't know if that really makes sense. But then maybe later on you come back to it and you're like, oh, now I get it. Like you just, I don't know. I think it's interesting. And that's something that sits out there and the data doesn't change, but your opinion and others' opinions can change. And depending on what you're referencing, like I just reviewed, or I'm working on a bunch of end wall speakers, and one of them was a Focal, and I don't remember how expensive they are, but they're pretty expensive. And I just kind of set them up. All I had was just
those
the one.
1000s.
Yeah, the 1000 IWLCR6, I think.
Yeah, some blah 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 blah.
So yeah, with end wall speakers, you can't really stick them in a wall unless you start. And I'm not cutting another hole in my garage wall. I'm just not doing it. So. But I did kind of set them up against the wall, and I said, this maybe will give me an idea. And then when I look at the measurements, if I see something that just is totally out of whack, then I'll know something's wrong with the measurements, But anyway, so I made a couple notes, and one was that it was kind of sibilant and that it was kind of boomy, and the mid-range sounded off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. When I go look at the data, there's a really high Q peak, like around 100 hertz or so. So really small enclosure, right? Very high Q peak, really boomy sound. And then the treble was boosted around probably 3 dB or so. And I'm like, well, there it is in the data. Like perfect. Yeah. But I could not figure out what was going on in the mid-range. Well, the mid-range was okay. It was just the stuff to the side of the mid-range that was bad. The highs were boosted and the low was super high boosted.
Yeah.
So I think that I say all that to basically say, when we're talking about subjective terms and how we evaluate speakers and things like that, some people may have just jumped straight to the mid-range sounds fine, but the bass is boosted or something like that. And whereas I was thinking something's up with the mid-range too. Well, it wasn't that. It was just that the other stuff was messed up relative to the mid-range.